Hey Kipsters, it's Mrs. Walsh. I'm super excited to be able to read Fantastic Mr. Fox with you guys today. Today we're going to read chapters 3 and 4. If you watched the video from yesterday, you're good to go ahead and watch this one. If you missed listening to chapters 1 and 2 with Miss Rondo, go ahead and pause this video and go find Miss Rondo's link so you know what's going on in the story. Before we jump into the book today, I want to review what Miss Rondo went over yesterday in her video. Yesterday, you guys realized that the story we're reading, Fantastic Mr. Fox, is a fiction story, so our thinking jobs are C, P, S, L. Yesterday, you talked a lot about the characters in the story and you described them with Miss Rondo. Today, we're going to go a little bit further and start talking about the problem and solution in the story. To remind you what you read yesterday, the farmers hatched a plan to try to catch Mr. Fox, but their first plan failed. Right at the end of chapter 2, the farmers came up with a new plan to wait outside the foxhole for Mr. Fox to come out and then shoot him as he comes out of the hole. Today we're going to read to find out if their second plan worked. In our story today, we have a couple of new vocabulary words that I want to go over with you before we jump in. The first word is the word goon. That might not be a word you've ever heard before, but a goon is someone who is silly or foolish. I chose the picture of the farmers to represent the word goon because you will find in the story that they are definitely silly and foolish. The second word is the word poisonous. If something is poisonous, it's harmful and could cause harm or even death. Two more words that we're going to see in this text are the words glum and quivering. Glum is a feeling of unhappy or hopelessness. If you are quivering, you shake in a small but quick way. You'll be listening out today for those 4 vocabulary words as I'm reading chapters 3 and 4. Our focus for today when we're reading the story are these 2 big ideas. The first one is, can you describe the farmer's plan to capture Mr. Fox? Our second big idea is to think about how do the illustrations help the readers understand the story. These are the 2 questions we're going to think about while we're reading and at the end of our 2 chapters today. All right, Kipsters, I'm excited. It's time to jump into chapter 3. Chapter 3, the shooting. Well, my darling, said Mr. Fox, what shall it be tonight? I think we'll have duck tonight, said Mrs. Fox. Bring us 2 fat ducks, if you please, 1 for you and me, and 1 for the children. Ducks it shall be, said Mr. Fox, Bunce's best. Now do be careful, said Mrs. Fox. My darling, said Mr. Fox, I can smell those goons a mile away. I can even smell one from the other. Baugus gives off a filthy stink of rotten chicken skins. Bunce reeks of goose livers. And as for Bean, the fumes of apple cider hang around him like poisonous gases. Yes, but just don't get careless, said Mrs. Fox. You know they'll be waiting for you, all 3 of them. Don't you worry about me, said Mr. Fox. I'll see you later. But Mr. Fox would not have been quite so cocky had he known exactly where the 3 farmers were waiting at that moment. They were just outside the entrance to the hole, each one crouching behind a tree with his gun loaded. And what is more, they had chosen their positions very carefully, making sure that the wind was not blowing from them towards the foxhole. In fact, it was blowing in the opposite direction. There was no chance of them being smelled out. Mr. Fox crept up the dark tunnel to the mouth of his hole. He poked his long, handsome face out into the night air and sniffed once. He moved an inch or 2 forward and stopped. He sniffed again. He was always especially careful when coming out from his hole. The questions I want you to think about here before we go on is, what is the farmer's plan to catch Mr. Fox, and do you think it will work? Go ahead and pause this video and think about your answer to that question before you move on. What is the farmer's plan to catch Mr. Fox, and do you think it will work? I hope that you reminded yourself of the farmer's new plan on the last page. The farmer's new plan is to wait outside of Mr. Fox's hole so that they can catch him there. They're standing so that Mr. Fox cannot smell them when he comes out. I don't know whether you think the plan will work or not, but let's read to find out. He inched forward a little more. The front half of his body was now in the open. His black nose twitched from side to side, sniffing and sniffing for the scent of danger. He found none, and he was just about to go trotting forward into the wood when he heard, or thought he heard, a tiny noise, a soft rustling sound, as though someone had moved a foot ever so gently through a patch of dry leaves. Mr. Fox flattened his body against the ground and lay very still. His ears pricked. He waited a long time, but he heard nothing. It must have been a field mouse, he told himself, or some other small animal. He crept a little further out of the hole, then further still. He was almost right out in the open now. He took a last careful look around. The wood was murky and very still. Somewhere in the sky the moon was shining. Just then his sharp night eyes caught a glint of something bright behind a tree not far away. It was a small silver speck of moonlight shining on a polished surface. Mr. Fox lay still watching it. What on earth was it? Now it was moving. It was coming up and up. Great heavens! It was the barrel of a gun. Quick as a whip, Mr. Fox jumped back into his hole, and at that same instant, the entire wood seemed to explode around him. Bang, 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 bang. The smoke from the 3 guns floated upward in the night air. Bogus and Bunce and Bean came out from behind their trees and walked towards the hole. "Did we get 'em?" said Bean. One of them shone a flashlight on the hole, and there on the ground, in the circle of light, half in and half out of the hole, lay the poor, tattered, blood-stained remains of a fox's tail. Bean picked it up. "We got the tail, but we missed the fox," he said, tossing the thing away. "Dang and blast," said Bogus. "We shot too late. We should have let fly the moment he poked his head out." "He won't be poking it out again in a hurry," Bunce said. Bean pulled a flask from his pocket and took a swig of cider. Then he said, "It'll take 3 days at least before he gets hungry enough to come out again. I'm not sitting around here waiting for that. Let's dig him out." "Ah," said Bogus, "now you're making sense. We can dig him out in a couple of hours. We know he's there." "I reckon there's a whole family of them down in that hole," Bunce said. "Then we'll have the lot," said Bean. "Get the shovels." So that was the end of chapter 3. Now that we've finished chapter 3, I want you to think about these 2 questions before we move on to chapter 4. How is the farmer's plan to catch the fox changed? And why did the plan change? Before you move on to the next chapter, pause the video and think about your answer to that question. I'll tell you what I think before we start chapter 4. Before we start chapter 4, I want to go over the answer to the question I asked at the end of chapter 3. The question was, how did the farmer's plan change and why did it change? So we know that their plan is going to have to change because they weren't successful in catching Mr. Fox. They were able to shoot his tail off, but that was not their goal. So now in chapter 4, the farmers are going to change their plan. Let's read and find out what they try to do next. Chapter 4, The Terrible Shovels. Down the hole, Mr. Fox was tenderly licking the stump of Mr. Fox's tail to stop the bleeding. "It was the finest tail for miles around," she said between licks. "It hurts," said Mr. Fox. "I know it does, sweetheart, but it'll soon get better." "And it will soon grow again, Dad," said one of the small foxes. "It will never grow again," said Mr. Fox. "I shall be tailless for the rest of my life." He looked very glum. So now that you've answered the question at the end of chapter 3, I'll tell you what I think before we jump into chapter 4. So in terms of how the farmer's plan has changed, They've come up with 2 plans so far, and neither one of them has worked. Their plan to wait outside the hole almost worked, but they weren't able to get Mr. Fox. So now they've changed their plan, and they're going to dig with shovels. We'll have to see if this plan actually works in Chapter 4. Let's get started. Chapter 4, The Terrible Shovels. Down the hole, Mr. Fox was Mrs. Fox. Good readers always go back and reread when they make a mistake, so I'm going to start this over. Down the hole, Mrs. Fox was tenderly licking the stump of Mr. Fox's tail to stop the bleeding. "It was the finest tail for miles around," she said between licks. "It hurts," said Mr. Fox. "I know it does, sweetheart, but it'll soon get better." "And it will soon grow again, Dad," said one of the small foxes. "It will never grow again," said Mr. Fox. "I shall be tailless for the rest of my life." He looked very glum. There was no food for the foxes that night, and soon the children dozed off. Then Mrs. Fox dozed off, but Mr. Fox couldn't sleep because of the pain in the stump of his tail. "Well," he thought, "I suppose I'm lucky to be alive at all. And now they've found our hole. We're going to have to move out as soon as possible. We'll never get any peace if we—" What was that? He turned his head sharply and listened. The noise he heard now was the most frightening noise a fox can ever hear. The scrape, scrape, scraping of shovels digging into the soil. "Wake up!" he shouted. "They're digging us out." Mrs. Fox was wide awake in 1 second. She sat up, quivering all over. "Are you sure that's it?" she whispered. "I'm positive. Listen." "They'll kill my children," cried Mrs. Fox. "Never," said Mr. Fox. "But, darling, they will," sobbed Mrs. Fox. "You know they will." Scrunch, scrunch, scrunch went the shovels above their heads. Small stones and bits of earth began falling from the roof of the tunnel. "How will they kill us, Mummy?" asked one of the small foxes. His round black eyes were huge with fright. "Will there be dogs?" he said. Mrs. Fox began to cry. She gathered her 4 children close to her and held them tight. Suddenly, there was an especially loud crunch above their heads, and the sharp end of a shovel came right through the ceiling. We're going to stop here before moving on and answer the question you see on the screen. The question is, how is the fox family feeling? Whenever we answer questions like this, we always need to provide evidence. So the next question is, how do you know? And how does the illustration provide evidence? If you want to think about this one, you can press pause on the video and think about your answer. I'm going to do a think aloud to let you know what I'm thinking. When I think about how the fox family is feeling, I'm going to go back to the text. It says in the text that the small foxes are asking questions about how they're going to be harmed by the farmers. It said that one of the small fox's eyes were huge and full of fright, or huge with fright. This lets me know that if someone is frightened, it means that they're scared. Mrs. Fox has also cried on both of the previous 2 pages, which tells me that she is probably scared, but possibly also feeling sad or a little bit shocked. When I look at the picture and the illustration, Mr. Fox's eyes and Mrs. Fox's eyes are huge. I know in other stories I've read that when an illustration shows a character's eyes being huge, it can mean that they're frightened or even possibly surprised. That's why I think the foxes are probably feeling upset, sad, surprised, and frightened. The sight of this awful thing seemed to have an electric effect on Mr. Fox. He jumped up and shouted, "I've got it! Come on! There's not a moment to lose. Why didn't I think of it before?" "Think of what, Dad?" "A fox can dig quicker than a man," shouted Mr. Fox, beginning to dig. "Nobody in the world can dig as quick as a fox." The soil began to fly out furiously behind Mr. Fox as he started to dig for dear life with his front feet. Mrs. Fox ran forward to help him. So did the 4 children. Go downwards, ordered Mr. Fox. We've got to go deep as we possibly can. The tunnel began to grow longer and longer. It sloped steeply downward. Deeper and deeper below the surface of the ground it went. The mother and the father and all 4 of the children were digging together. Their front legs were moving so fast you couldn't see them. And gradually the scrunching and scraping of the shovels became fainter and fainter. After about an hour, Mr. Fox stopped digging. "Hold it," he said. They all stopped. They turned and looked back up the long tunnel they had just dug. All was quiet. "Whew," said Mr. Fox. "I think we've done it. They'll never get as deep as this. Well done, everyone." They all sat down, panting for breath. And Mrs. Fox said to her children, "I should like you to know that if it wasn't for your father, we should all be dead by now. Your father is a fantastic fox." Mr. Fox looked at his wife and she smiled. He loved her more than ever when she said things like that. So that was the end of chapter 4 and the end of our reading for today. So what I want you to think about now is when we get to the end of a chapter, we always want to think about how did that chapter end. We need to make sure that we know where the story left off so we know where the next chapter will pick up. This chapter ended with the Fox family having dug deep, deep, deep into the ground to get away from the shovels. Now, Mr. Fox at the end of the story thinks that they've done it. He says that they'll never get as deep as this. We'll find out tomorrow whether or not Mr. Fox was correct. What I want you to do now, before you finish up this video for today, is I want you to write a sentence down in the comment box under the YouTube video that describes part of the farmer's plan to capture the fox. We've read 4 chapters, and 3 of those chapters give a lot of details about the farmer's plan. Please write at least one sentence that describes part of their plan. So not their whole plan, but pick a part of the plan to describe. Type it in the comment box, and I can't wait to see what you come up with and what you remember from the text. Make sure you come back tomorrow. Miss Rondo is going to pick up with chapter 5, and we're going to see what these crazy farmers do next. I miss you guys, and I'm so glad you followed along and listened to the story today. I will see you on Thursday to keep reading the story. Watch tomorrow with Miss Rondo. Bye, friends.